The gentle chime of the door-bell echoed through Mason's fine jewelry as the clock struck 2:15 p.m. on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The owner, Mr. Chen, was carefully arranging a display of engagement rings while his longtime employee Mrs. Patel assisted an elderly couple browsing anniversary bands. The store, nestled in the heart of downtown, had been a community fixture for over 3 decades. At 6 feet 8 inches and 285 pounds, Anthony "Big Shaq" Thompson's presence was impossible to ignore as he ducked through the doorway. Despite his intimidating size, the former college basketball player turned youth basketball coach had a warm smile that put people at ease. He'd been saving up for months to buy his mother a special birthday gift, a delicate sapphire pendant she'd admired in the window during their last visit together. The peaceful atmosphere of the store was shattered when 3 masked figures burst through the door. The leader, wielding what appeared to be a handgun, shouted commands while his accomplices pulled out duffel bags. Mr. Chen instinctively raised his hands, his face pale with fear. Mrs. Patel quickly moved to shield the elderly couple, her years of emergency response training kicking in. Big Shaq, who had been examining a display case near the back, felt his heart racing. Time seemed to slow down as his mind processed the situation. His size had always made him stand out, but for the first time in his life, he was grateful for it. The robbers hadn't noticed him yet, focused as they were on the front counter where Mr. Chen stood trembling. Drawing from years of experience managing rowdy teenagers on the basketball court, Big Shaq knew the importance of staying calm under pressure. He noticed the security camera in the corner, the emergency button under the counter, and most importantly, the slight shake in the lead robber's hand, a sign of nervousness that Big Shaq recognized from his own players before big games. The first robber began shoving jewelry into his bag while the second moved toward the safe in the back. The third kept his weapon trained on the customers and staff, but his attention was divided. Big Shaq saw his opportunity. He had always taught his players that timing was everything, whether on the court or in life. Moving with surprising agility for someone his size, Big Shaq quietly positioned himself behind a display case. He could hear Mr. Chen trying to reason with the robbers, speaking in a steady voice despite his fear. The elderly couple held each other tightly, while Mrs. Patel maintained her protective stance in front of them, her eyes alert and searching for any chance to help. The tension in the room was palpable as the robbers grew more agitated with each passing second. Big Shaq knew he had to act soon, before someone got hurt. He thought of his mother, of his basketball kids, of all the times he'd told them that real courage wasn't about being fearless, but about doing what's right despite being afraid. The lead robber turned his back for just a moment, frustrated by Mr. Chen's apparent slowness in opening the high-end display case. That split second was all Big Shaq needed. With the same explosive power he'd once used to dominate the paint on the basketball court, he made his move. The story of what happened next would soon become a legend in their small community, a testament to how ordinary people could rise to extraordinary occasions when it mattered most. As Big Shaq prepared to act, he recalled a conversation he'd had with his team just the day before about making good decisions under pressure. Little did he know that he was about to become the living embodiment of his own teachings. The next few moments would test everything he believed about courage, timing, and the responsibility we have to help others in their moment of need. The next few moments unfolded like a scene from an action movie, but with the raw, unpolished edge of reality. Big Shaq's basketball shoes squeaked softly against the polished floor as he moved. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady, just like they had been during championship games in his college days. The lead robber was still struggling with the display case, growing increasingly frustrated with its security features. "Hurry up, old man," he barked at Mr. Chen, who was deliberately taking his time, his trembling hands working the lock with careful precision. Mrs. Patel caught Big Shaq's eye for a brief moment, and a flash of understanding passed between them. Big Shaq had always told his young players that basketball wasn't just about physical strength, it was about strategy, about reading your opponent's movements, about anticipating their next move. Now, those lessons were about to save lives. He noticed the second robber's grip on his duffel bag loosening as he reached for another display case, while the third seemed distracted by a sudden police siren in the distance. Drawing upon years of coaching experience, Big Shaq knew that panic was contagious, but so was calm. He took a deep breath, remembering the breathing exercises he taught his team before big games. The elderly couple had managed to slowly edge toward the door, guided by Mrs. Patel's subtle hand gestures. Mr. Chen kept the lead robber's attention focused on the front display, his deliberate movements buying precious seconds. Big Shaq made his move with the same fluid grace that had earned him his nickname on the court. In one smooth motion, he grabbed a heavy jewelry bust from a nearby display and hurled it across the room. The bust crashed into a glass case near the entrance, sending shards of glass and costume jewelry flying everywhere. The sudden chaos had its intended effect, all three robbers spun toward the noise. That split second of distraction was all he needed. Big Shaq charged forward, his massive frame moving with surprising speed. He grabbed the third robber from behind, using a bear hug technique he'd learned from his high school wrestling coach. The robber's weapon, which turned out to be a realistic-looking pellet gun, clattered to the floor. Mrs. Patel sprang into action immediately, her emergency response training taking over. She quickly ushered the elderly couple out the front door while shouting for help. Mr. Chen lunged for the silent alarm button he'd been inching toward for the past few minutes. The lead robber turned back, but the moment of confusion had cost him his advantage. The second robber, panicking at the sight of his partner subdued by Big Shaq, made a dash for the door but slipped on the scattered jewelry. He went down hard, his duffel bag spilling open and sending stolen watches skittering across the floor. The lead robber, now realizing his plan was unraveling, faced a critical decision. Outside, sirens grew louder. Someone in the cafe across the street had seen the commotion and called 911. The lead robber looked from his fallen partner to Big Shaq, who still held the third robber firmly despite his struggles. The weight of the moment hung in the air like heavy storm clouds before a downpour. "It's over," Big Shaq said, his voice carrying the same firm but calm tone he used when breaking up fights at basketball practice. "The police are coming. Don't make this worse than it already is." His words seemed to reach something in the lead robber, whose shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of reality. But the situation was far from resolved. The lead robber's hand tightened on his weapon, and his eyes darted between the door and Mr. Chen. Big Shaq could see the man's desperation growing, like a cornered animal. He knew the next few moments would be crucial, just like the final seconds of a tied game, when one decision could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The story was about to take another dramatic turn, as the sounds of police cars screeching to a halt outside filled the air. Big Shaq maintained his grip on the third robber, but his eyes were fixed on the leader. In this moment, he wasn't just a former basketball player or a youth coach, he was the only thing standing between a desperate criminal and potential tragedy. The next few seconds would test not just his physical strength, but everything he believed about courage, redemption, and the power of staying calm in the face of chaos. Time seemed to freeze in the jewelry store as red and blue lights flashed through the windows, casting dancing shadows across the scattered gems on the floor. Big Shaq's arms were beginning to tire from restraining the third robber, but years of conditioning and countless hours in the gym had prepared him for moments of endurance like this. The lead robber's attention snapped between the front door and Mr. Chen, who had positioned himself behind the relative safety of the heavy wooden counter. Mrs. Patel had successfully guided the elderly couple outside but remained near the entrance, refusing to completely abandon her workplace family. Her presence seemed to provide silent strength to Mr. Chen, whose eyes never left the lead robber. Outside, police officers were taking positions, their voices carrying through the glass as they began establishing a perimeter. The second robber was still on the floor, clutching his knee where he'd fallen on the scattered jewelry. His quiet groans of pain added to the tense atmosphere. Big Shaq knew he had to keep talking, had to find a way to reach the lead robber before the situation escalated. He thought about the troubled kids he'd coached, how sometimes the toughest ones were just people who'd lost their way. "Listen," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I work with young people every day. I've seen plenty of good kids make bad choices. But what matters most is what you do next." The lead robber's hand trembled slightly, and for the first time, his mask shifted enough to reveal young, frightened eyes. They couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Big Shaq pressed on, using the same tone he used when talking down angry players after a tough loss. "Those police officers out there, they're going to come in one way or another. But right now, you still have a choice about how this ends." Mr. Chen, sensing the shift in atmosphere, slowly raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "No one has been hurt," he said softly, his accent thick with emotion. "My store, the jewelry, these things can be replaced. But your lives? Your futures? These are precious things that cannot be restored once broken." The third robber, still held firmly in Big Shaq's grip, had stopped struggling. The fight seemed to drain out of him as the reality of their situation sank in. Through the windows, they could see more police cars arriving, their sirens now silent but lights still painting the street in emergency colors. Big Shaq felt a change in the room's energy, like when the momentum shifts during a crucial game. He'd always believed in the power of second chances, it was why he devoted his life to coaching young people. "I know you're scared," he continued, "but think about tomorrow. Think about your families. There's still time to make this right." The lead robber's breathing had become ragged, visible even through his mask. The weight of his choices seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Outside, a police negotiator had arrived and was speaking through a megaphone, but the words seemed distant compared to the intimate drama unfolding inside the store. Mrs. Patel, still by the door, spoke up with motherly concern in her voice. "You boys remind me of my own sons," she said gently. "Whatever troubles brought you here today, they're not worth throwing your lives away. Please, let us help you make the right choice." The second robber on the floor had managed to sit up, cradling his injured knee. He looked at his leader, then at Big Shaq, before slowly reaching up to remove his mask. His young face was streaked with tears. "She's right, man," he said to the leader. "This ain't worth it. We messed up." Big Shaq could see the leader's resolve crumbling. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't making a grand gesture or being a hero, it was simply admitting when you were wrong and accepting the consequences. He'd taught this lesson countless times on the basketball court, but never had it carried such weight. The next few moments would determine not just the outcome of this robbery, but potentially the entire direction of these young lives. As the police negotiator's voice grew clearer outside, Big Shaq maintained his firm but compassionate presence. He knew that sometimes the biggest victories came not from confrontation, but from finding the humanity in even the most desperate situations. Mrs. Patel had taken a cautious step forward, her maternal instincts seemingly overwhelming her fear. Mr. Chen remained still, his eyes reflecting not anger but a deep sadness for the young lives on the brink of disaster. The atmosphere in the store had transformed from one of terror to something more complex, a moment of potential redemption hanging in the balance. The sound of the lead robber's weapon clattering to the floor broke the tension like a thunderclap. He slowly raised his hands, then reached up with trembling fingers to remove his mask. The face revealed was young and frightened, streaked with sweat and tears. Big Shaq felt his heart ache at how much this boy reminded him of some of his players, young men with potential who sometimes just needed someone to believe in them. "I'm sorry," the leader whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." His words seemed to echo in the quiet store, bouncing off the glass cases and scattered jewelry. Mr. Chen nodded slowly, compassion replacing fear in his eyes. Mrs. Patel moved to the door to signal the police, her movements careful and deliberate. Big Shaq maintained his hold on the third robber but gentled his grip. "It's okay, son. You're doing the right thing now." The young man in his arms had also stopped resisting, accepting the inevitable with what seemed like relief. The second robber remained seated on the floor, his injured knee forgotten in the emotional weight of the moment. Outside, the police negotiator had fallen silent, likely noticing the change in atmosphere through the store's windows. The red and blue lights continued their silent dance across the walls, creating an almost dreamlike quality to the scene. Big Shaq thought about all the times he'd talked to his team about accountability, about facing consequences, about the strength it takes to admit when you're wrong. Mrs. Patel opened the door slowly, her hands raised to show the police she wasn't a threat. Her voice carried clearly as she called out, "They're surrendering. The situation is under control." The professionalism in her tone, developed through years of handling store emergencies, helped keep everyone calm as the police began their approach. The lead robber sank to his knees, placing his hands behind his head without being told. His young face showed a mix of fear and resignation, but also something else, perhaps the first glimmer of relief that comes with stopping a headlong rush toward disaster. The second robber remained where he was, hands also raised, while Big Shaq waited for police instructions regarding the third. As officers entered the store with weapons drawn, Big Shaq used his coach's voice one last time. "Everyone stay calm. Let's all go home safe today." The officers, recognizing his control of the situation, worked efficiently to secure the suspects. One of them, a veteran with kind eyes, nodded appreciatively at Big Shaq as he took custody of the third robber. Mr. Chen had emerged from behind the counter, straightening his jacket as if trying to restore some normalcy to the situation. He watched the young robbers being handcuffed with an expression that spoke of both sadness and hope. "Sometimes," he said quietly to Big Shaq, "the greatest courage is shown not in the mistake, but in choosing to make it right." As the police began taking statements, Big Shaq noticed the leader looking back at him. The boy's eyes held a question, and Big Shaq knew exactly what it was, the same question he'd seen in the eyes of players who'd made mistakes and feared they'd lost their chance at redemption. He gave the young man a nod, trying to convey what he always told his team, that every end could also be a beginning. Mrs. Patel had begun picking up scattered jewelry, her practical nature taking over now that the danger had passed. She paused occasionally to answer police questions, her account clear and precise. The elderly couple had returned to give their statements, the wife clutching her husband's arm but speaking with surprising warmth about how Mrs. Patel had protected them. The scene was transforming from one of crisis to cleanup, but Big Shaq knew the real work was just beginning. As he gave his statement to a detective, he found himself thinking about second chances and redemption. He thought about his mother's sapphire pendant, still waiting to be purchased, and about how life's most precious moments often come disguised as its biggest challenges. News vans were beginning to arrive outside, their reporters sensing a story that went beyond a simple robbery attempt. But Big Shaq knew the real story wasn't about heroics or headlines, it was about choices, consequences, and the possibility of change. He'd seen it countless times on the basketball court. Sometimes the game's biggest lessons had nothing to do with scoring points. The detective interviewing Big Shaq couldn't hide his admiration. "You took a big risk," he said, closing his notebook. "Could have gone bad real quick." Big Shaq nodded, thinking of all the split-second decisions that had led to this moment. "Sometimes," he replied, "you've got to trust your instincts and hope you're making the right call." As the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the now quiet store, Big Shaq realized he'd probably miss basketball practice today. But maybe, he thought, he'd given his most important coaching lesson yet, not on a court, but in a jewelry store where 3 young lives had hung in the balance. The next few hours passed in a blur of police interviews, news reporters, and cleanup efforts. Big Shaq watched as forensics teams carefully documented the scene, photographing scattered jewelry and collecting evidence. Despite the chaos, there was something almost peaceful about the methodical way they worked, restoring order to the disrupted store. Mr. Chen had pulled out a dusty kettle from the back room and was brewing tea for everyone, police officers, store employees, and even the shaken elderly couple who had stayed to help clean up. The simple act seemed to ground everyone, turning the jewelry store from a crime scene back into a place of community. The aromatic steam rising from the cups carried memories of countless ordinary days that had come before this extraordinary one. Big Shaq sat in a chair that seemed too small for his frame, holding a delicate teacup that looked almost comical in his massive hands. His phone had been buzzing non-stop, first with worried messages from his assistant coach about his missed practice, then with texts from players who had somehow already heard about what happened. Local news stations had begun reporting the story, and clips were spreading rapidly across social media. Mrs. Patel had just finished giving her statement to the police when she paused by Big Shaq's chair. "You know," she said softly, adjusting her slightly disheveled hijab, "I've worked here for 15 years. Never thought I'd see anything like this. But also never thought I'd see such courage." She smiled warmly at him before continuing her meticulous inventory of the damaged display cases. The elderly couple, who introduced themselves as the Hendersons, shared their perspective with a detective. Mrs. Henderson spoke about how calm Mrs. Patel had been while guiding them to safety, while Mr. Henderson couldn't stop praising Big Shaq's quick thinking. "It reminded me of my days in the service," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting, it's finding a way to end things peacefully." As the afternoon wore on, Big Shaq learned more about the young robbers through snippets of police conversations. They were local boys, all between 18 and 20 years old. The leader, it turned out, had a sick mother and mounting medical bills. The second robber was trying to pay off his father's gambling debts. The third had simply fallen in with the wrong crowd after losing his job. Their stories weren't excuses, but they were reminders of how desperation could drive people to make terrible choices. One of the detectives, a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, sat down next to Big Shaq. "Those boys are lucky," she said, pulling out her notebook. "Not just because you stopped them, but because of how you stopped them. You gave them a chance to make a better choice. In my 20 years on the force, I've seen how rare that is." Mr. Chen had been on the phone with his insurance company, but he kept pausing to share details about his store's history with anyone who would listen. It was as if telling these stories helped him reclaim the space, transforming it back from a crime scene into his beloved shop. He spoke about opening the store 30 years ago, about watching children grow up and come in to buy engagement rings, about being part of countless special moments in people's lives. Outside, the media circus was growing. Local news vans had multiplied, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Reporters peered through the windows, hoping to catch glimpses of the gentle giant who had talked down armed robbers. Big Shaq knew they wanted interviews, wanted to turn this into a story of heroism, but he felt uncomfortable with that narrative. To him, this had just been about doing what needed to be done. His thoughts were interrupted by a call from his mother. She'd seen the news and was beside herself with worry. As he reassured her that he was fine, he couldn't help but smile at the irony. He'd come to the store to buy her a birthday gift, and instead had given her the gift of anxiety. "Mama," he said warmly, "you always told me to help people when I could. I was just doing what you taught me." The forensics team was finishing up, carefully placing evidence in sealed bags. Among the items was the fake gun the robbers had used. It looked real enough to have fooled everyone. Big Shaq felt a chill thinking about how differently things could have ended if someone had panicked, if fear had won out over hope. Mrs. Patel's phone chimed with a message from her son's school. She was going to be late for pickup. The normalcy of the reminder seemed to startle everyone, a gentle nudge that the world outside hadn't stopped turning. Mr. Chen insisted she go, promising to handle the rest of the cleanup. As she gathered her things, she paused to straighten a photo frame that had been knocked askew during the chaos, a simple gesture that somehow symbolized the gradual return to normalcy. As evening approached, the jewelry store took on a different character, with long shadows stretching across the newly cleaned floors. The police had finally finished their work, leaving behind only a single officer to guard the store until the broken displays could be secured. The news vans outside had thinned out, though a few persistent reporters still lingered, hoping to catch final statements from anyone involved. Big Shaq's basketball team had shown up en masse after practice, pressing their faces against the store windows until he went out to speak with them. They crowded around him, a dozen teenagers with wide eyes and endless questions. Their assistant coach stood back, shaking his head with a mixture of admiration and relief. Big Shaq used the moment to turn it into an impromptu life lesson, just as he always did. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying the same authority it did during crucial game moments. "What happened today wasn't about being tough or being a hero. It was about seeing people as people, even when they're making mistakes. It was about keeping calm when everything inside you is saying to panic." The teenagers nodded, unusually quiet as they absorbed his words. Inside the store, Mr. Chen was on another call, this time with his daughter who was studying abroad. The parts of the conversation that drifted out were in rapid Mandarin, but the emotion in his voice needed no translation. He was assuring her that he was safe, that the store could be repaired, that everything would be okay. As he spoke, he absently polished an undamaged display case, the familiar motion seeming to comfort him. The Hendersons had finally been convinced to head home, but not before Mrs. Henderson had hugged everyone, including the somewhat startled police officer on guard duty. Mr. Henderson had pressed his card into Big Shaq's hand, insisting that they owed him dinner at the very least. "We've been married 52 years, he'd said, his voice wavering slightly. "Thanks to you and Mrs. Patel, we'll get to celebrate 53. As the day's excitement began to wind down, a social worker arrived to discuss the young robbers' situations. She sat with Big Shaq, Mr. Chen, and the detective, sharing what she could about the boys' backgrounds. The leader's mother really was sick, cancer, it turned out, and the medical bills had been overwhelming. The second boy's father's gambling addiction had left the family deep in debt. The third young man had lost his job when the factory he worked at closed down. None of this excuses what they did, the social worker explained, pushing her glasses up her nose. But understanding why people make desperate choices helps us prevent others from making the same mistakes. Big Shaq thought about the at-risk kids he worked with through his basketball program, how many of them were just one bad decision away from a similar fate. Mr. Chen, who had been quiet during most of the discussion, suddenly spoke up. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "when all this is settled, we could find a way to help them make things right." The others looked at him in surprise. He shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Everyone deserves a chance to correct their path. Isn't that what you taught us today?" He nodded toward Big Shaq. The remaining police officer, who had been trying to maintain a professional demeanor, couldn't help but join the conversation. "You know," he said, "we have youth outreach programs at the precinct. Maybe we could work together, the store, the police, coach here with his basketball program. Turn this whole thing into something positive." As they discussed possibilities, Big Shaq received another call, this time from the local youth center where he ran his basketball program. The director had heard about what happened and wanted to know if Big Shaq would be willing to speak at their upcoming community safety workshop. "Your story shows there's a better way to handle conflict," she said. "These kids need to hear that." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that reflected off the remaining jewelry in the displays. The day's events had left everyone exhausted but somehow hopeful. Mr. Chen's store, which had started the day as just another small business, had become something more, a symbol of how a community could come together in crisis. A young reporter, probably on her first assignment, was the last media person remaining outside. When Big Shaq finally agreed to a brief statement, her question surprised him. Instead of asking about the robbery, she asked what message he hoped people would take from this story. He thought about his players, about the young robbers, about Mr. Chen's forgiveness and Mrs. Patel's courage. "I'd say," he answered carefully, "that strength isn't just about size or power. It's about making choices that help others, even when you're scared. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even people who are making mistakes. And most importantly, it's about believing that it's never too late to change course." The next few days brought changes no one could have anticipated. The story of the jewelry store incident had spread far beyond their small community, touching hearts and inspiring conversations about compassion, second chances, and the power of staying calm under pressure. Big Shaq's phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from national news outlets, but he kept turning them down, preferring to focus on his team and the local community that had supported him. The morning after the incident, Mr. Chen arrived at his store to find hundreds of flowers and cards left by community members. Messages of support were taped to the temporarily boarded-up windows, and local businesses had put up signs declaring, "We stand together," and "Community strong." The elderly couple, the Hendersons, had organized a cleanup crew of volunteers who showed up with brooms, dustpans, and determined smiles. Mrs. Patel's sons had convinced their school to start a conflict resolution program, inspired by how their mother and Big Shaq had handled the situation. The principal had invited Big Shaq to speak at an assembly, where he shared his experience with hundreds of attentive students. The real victory, he told them, wasn't in stopping the robbery, it was in stopping it without anyone getting hurt, physically or spiritually. The police department had followed through on their suggestion of collaboration. They were working with Big Shaq to develop a youth outreach program that combined sports with mentorship. The detective with the graying hair had become a regular at basketball practices, sharing her own stories of how communication and calm thinking had saved lives throughout her career. Word had gotten around about the robbers' backgrounds, and the community had responded in unexpected ways. A local medical foundation reached out about helping with the leader's mother's medical bills. A financial advisor offered free services to families struggling with gambling addiction. The Factory Workers Union started a job placement program for displaced workers. None of this erased what the young men had done, but it showed how tragedy could spark positive change. Mr. Chen had surprised everyone by announcing he would press charges but also advocate for a rehabilitation program rather than harsh punishment. "These boys needed help before they came into my store," he explained to a local reporter. "Perhaps now they can get it." He had even offered part-time jobs to the young men after they served their time, believing that employment and purpose were the best deterrents to desperation. Big Shaq's basketball team had been profoundly affected by the incident. They started volunteering at local community centers, organizing fundraisers for families in need, and even starting a peer counseling program. "Coach showed us that real strength isn't about intimidation," one player explained during a local news interview. "It's about lifting people up when they're at their lowest." The story had particularly resonated with teenagers in the community. Local schools reported increased interest in conflict resolution programs and peer mediation. The youth center where Big Shaq coached had seen a surge in enrollment, with many young people saying they wanted to learn from someone who understood that violence wasn't the answer. Mrs. Patel had become something of a local hero herself, especially among immigrant families in the community. Her calm handling of the crisis while protecting others had inspired many. She started teaching free emergency response classes at the community center, sharing her knowledge with others who wanted to be prepared for crisis situations. The incident had even influenced how local businesses approached security. Instead of just installing more cameras and alarms, many were investing in de-escalation training for their employees. Mr. Chen's story of how understanding and compassion had prevented potential tragedy became a case study in these sessions. One particularly touching moment came when Big Shaq finally returned to buy his mother's birthday present. Mr. Chen insisted on giving him the sapphire pendant at cost, but Big Shaq refused any special treatment. Instead, they compromised by agreeing that the full markup would go to the new community outreach program. When Big Shaq's mother received the pendant, she cried not just because of its beauty, but because of the story it represented. The local paper ran a follow-up story a week after the incident, focusing not on the attempted robbery but on the wave of positive changes it had inspired. They interviewed the social worker who had been working with the young robbers. "Sometimes," she said, "it takes a crisis to show us where our community needs healing. What matters is what we do with that knowledge." Local business owners started a fund to help struggling families before they reached the point of desperation. They named it the Second Chance Fund, inspired by how the jewelry store incident had ended. The first anonymous donation had come with a note that read simply, "Because someone gave me a chance to make a better choice." As Big Shaq sat in his office at the youth center, looking at the newspaper clipping one of his players had framed for him, he reflected on how a moment of crisis had transformed into something much more meaningful. The article's headline read, "Local Coach Turns Jewelry Store Crisis into Community Gold." But to Big Shaq, the real gold wasn't in any jewelry case, it was in the way people had come together, choosing hope over fear, understanding over anger, and community over chaos. 1 year after the incident at Mason's Fine Jewelry, the store hosted a special community gathering. The display cases gleamed under newly installed lights, and the space had been transformed into something that felt both familiar and new. Mr. Chen had renovated the store not just to repair the damage, but to create a more open, welcoming environment. The security upgrades were subtle, focused more on creating connection than barriers. Big Shaq ducked through the doorway, just as he had that fateful day, but this time he was greeted by smiles and warm handshakes. His mother wore the sapphire pendant proudly, its blue stone catching the light as she helped Mrs. Patel arrange refreshments on a table near the window. The Hendersons were there too, sharing stories with other community members who had gathered to mark the anniversary. The changes in the community over the past year had been remarkable. The Second Chance Fund had helped dozens of families avoid financial crisis, preventing countless potential tragedies before they could begin. Big Shaq's youth outreach program, now a collaboration between the police department and local schools, had expanded to 3 other districts. The waiting list for his basketball program had grown so long that he'd had to recruit other coaches to help. Mrs. Patel's emergency response classes had become so popular that she'd trained other instructors to meet the demand. She'd also started a support group for small business employees dealing with trauma or anxiety at work. Her sons, now in high school, had become peer mediators and were helping younger students learn conflict resolution skills. The most powerful stories, though, came from unexpected places. The 3 young men who had attempted the robbery had served their time and were now part of the rehabilitation program Mr. Chen had helped design. The leader's mother had received the medical treatment she needed, thanks to the community foundation. The second young man's father had finally gotten help for his gambling addiction, and the third had found steady work through the job placement program. As people mingled in the store, sharing refreshments and memories, Big Shaq noticed a new display case near the counter. Inside was a simple plaque that read, "Every ending can be a beginning. Every mistake can lead to growth. Every moment of darkness can reveal unexpected light." Below it, Mr. Chen had placed photographs showing the store's transformation and the community events that had grown from that challenging day. The local news was covering the anniversary gathering, but this time the story wasn't about crime or violence. It was about resilience, about how a community could turn a potential tragedy into triumph. The young reporter who had interviewed Big Shaq a year ago was back, now more experienced but still asking thoughtful questions about the lasting impact of that day. Big Shaq's basketball team arrived after practice, filling the store with their energy and enthusiasm. They wore new uniforms sponsored by local businesses, with "Community Strong" printed across the back. These kids had become ambassadors for the program's message, showing others how sports could teach lessons that reached far beyond the court. The detective with graying hair, now promoted to captain, shared updates about how the police department had changed its approach to community engagement. Crime rates had dropped significantly in areas where the new outreach programs were active. Other cities had started sending representatives to learn from their example. Mr. Chen's daughter, home from studying abroad, watched her father with pride as he moved through the crowd, greeting everyone by name. The store had become more than a business, it was a symbol of how crisis could forge stronger bonds between people. She had decided to come back after graduation to help expand their community initiatives. As the evening progressed, Big Shaq found himself standing near the spot where he had made his crucial decision a year ago. A young boy tugged at his sleeve, looking up with curious eyes. "My dad says you're a hero," the boy said. "Is that true?" Big Shaq knelt down to meet the child's gaze, remembering all the lessons this experience had taught him. "The real heroes," he replied, "are the people who wake up every day and choose to make their community better. The people who help others before they reach their breaking point. The people who see beyond mistakes to the humanity in everyone." The boy nodded seriously, though Big Shaq suspected he didn't fully understand yet. That was okay, understanding would come with time and experience. Mrs. Patel joined them, adding her own perspective. "You see that plaque?" she asked the boy. "It reminds us that sometimes the scariest moments can lead to the most beautiful changes. But only if we're brave enough to learn from them, and kind enough to help others learn too." As the gathering drew to a close, Big Shaq looked around at the faces that had become so familiar over the past year, Mr. Chen arranging his displays with the same care he always had, Mrs. Patel sharing wisdom with anyone who would listen, the Hendersons holding hands as they had for over 50 years, his basketball players showing the next generation what real strength looked like. The sun was setting outside, casting the same golden light that had filled the store a year ago. But now, instead of highlighting scattered jewelry and broken glass, it illuminated a community that had grown stronger through adversity. The story that had begun with an attempted robbery had evolved into something far more valuable than anything that could be kept in a display case. It had become a testament to the power of compassion, understanding, and the courage to choose a better path. As people began to leave, carrying with them not just memories but renewed commitment to their community, Big Shaq realized that some victories couldn't be measured in points scored or games won. Sometimes, the biggest wins came from moments when people chose hope over fear, understanding over judgment, and love over hate. That was the real story, not of a single heroic act, but of countless small choices that together had created something truly extraordinary.